For the past 5 years, I've heard that the retro video game bubble is going to burst soon, any day now. But it hasn't, and it won't. Hello and welcome to another episode of Retronomics, a series that talks about what's affecting video game pricing. Today we're going to talk about the retro video game bubble and how a lot of people have been saying that it's going to burst anytime soon, and soon video games won't be worth what they are today. And basically, retro video game prices will probably see a steady decline, but not in a catastrophic sense like the housing market. I did a video on this topic a long time ago, but I really didn't have the data to back it all up. And now that I've been doing a lot of these Retronomic episodes, I feel confident in telling a little bit more about why I think that the retro video game market is still healthy, and we're not going to see a huge drop off in retro video game prices anytime soon. Let's take a look at 3 popular games. You got Little Samson, Earthbound, and Panzer Dragoon Saga. Now, all of these games, if you take a look at their price trends, they all peaked around 2016. Well, Earthbound peaked around 2013, and they've remained steady ever since. And a price doesn't have to have a flat line in order for it to be steady. Basically, it can have a little bit ups and downs, but any sharp declines or sharp increases don't exist on these 3 games. And I guess you could say that the retro video game fad has peaked in 2016. I think a lot of people were rushing to buy all of these games and artificially inflate the prices. You had YouTubers giving out hidden gems, which also inflated the prices. And now it's starting to come down. I mean, there's only so many retro video games to cover, and I think we're going to see these games level out, but I don't think that they're going to crash the way that people have been saying. I mean, you can take Eco, for example. Eco is still rare, but it dropped 90% of its value because people wanted the HD collection. I think there are going to be other contributing factors that affect singular games and not necessarily the retro video game market as a whole. And I'm pretty sure that we're not going to see a boom for a number of years. PlayStation 2 is starting to get up a little bit more, but it's still relatively cheap. Same thing with Xbox. But I really think it'll be a good number of years before we see those huge booms again, especially since Xbox is now being backwards compatible with a lot of the original Xbox games. And PlayStation 2 is starting to have re-releases. You have Jak and Jak 2 being re-released by Limited Run. So a lot of those PlayStation 2 and Xbox games, they're already seeing their re-releases. So the prices of those games probably won't increase for a very long time. And of course, this is all speculation. And I think the casual fad of picking up old games that you grew up with is kind of cooling off. You have the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic. They came out, a lot of casual buyers bought them because they remember Mario and Star Fox and all these other awesome games. And then I think with the PlayStation Classic, despite all of its flaws, really showed that people are kind of not really interested in buying those particular games. But what those classic consoles did do is take off the popularity of collecting physical games and leaving it back to those people who have the space for it and have the money and the time and the effort to play it on these old finicky systems. And with the rumors of the N64 Mini pretty much dashed by Reggie, I don't think that we're going to see it anytime soon, and I really don't think that in this current climate with all licensing and everything like that required, that a Nintendo 64 Mini would sell well. I mean, would you buy a Nintendo 64 Classic without Banjo-Kazooie or without Conker or without GoldenEye? I mean, those were some very iconic games for the system. Or even if only Mario Party 2 was on there and you really like Mario Party 3, I mean, it goes either way. And the other thing that might affect retro video game prices is the re-releases like Metal Storm. Limited Run Games and Retrobit are releasing a limited collector's edition of Metal Storm for play on the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is amazing for people who don't want to spend that money on the original cartridge, and they can instead buy a legal reproduction. And I think it won't really affect the prices too much, but it could be one of those things that keeps that game steady. And I hope that they start looking into more expensive games and trying to get those licenses. You know, I would really like a very inexpensive legal copy of Little Samson. But the question does remain, will we see a crash? And no, I don't really think that we're going to see a crash. Retro video game prices will still remain high, and I think your hope that soon you'll be able to get your favorite rare games for less than $100 is kind of a pipe dream. I mean, basically, these games, especially since they're rare and they're iconic, will remain steady for a very long time, and maybe the older games like Jaws for the NES, for example, will be, you know, bargain bin 50 cents. So what could cause a retro video game crash? Well, there are only a handful of features that would cause prices to catastrophically drop, and that's a economic crisis. I mean, basically, if everybody had to sell off their retro video games to make rent or to, you know, buy food or something like that, then you would see a lot of games come into the market and start to flood it and eventually crash those prices. But I really think that that would only be temporary, as you have a lot of people who are probably in a very good financial situation to scoop up all of those games and then wait for the prices to rebound. But one other thing that could cause a catastrophic crash, which is very unlikely, is if Nintendo or any of these other video game companies or even GameStop come in and say, you know, hey, we just found cases upon cases of new old stock of NES games, and we're going to sell them for $35 a piece. And, you know, we've got 5,000 copies of Little Samson. We got 1,500 copies of Stadium Events. We got all these other games, Panzer Dragoon Saga, everything must go. Like, I think that's the only way that these prices are actually going to plummet. But I don't really see that happening anytime soon. Even if GameStop goes out of business, a lot of that stuff that they probably have is not going to be collector quality. I mean, sure, they have this big retro video game warehouse, but they've been slowly and quietly been phasing that stuff out. There are a lot of expensive games that they just stopped selling because a lot of people were sending in fakes. So it's definitely something that I think a lot of people say that, you know, GameStop going out of business would be something that would cause a video game crash, and I think that would definitely kill the popularity of retro video games even further. I mean, basically we're seeing in the next 2 generations we'll probably won't have any physical media whatsoever, and that's something that will probably kill the retro video game market altogether when it finally doesn't make a sense to have physical games and then go back and collect older generation games. I think you're going to see that be a bigger contributing factor, but even then, that's at least, I want to say, 5 to 10 years away. Like, we have PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, those are kind of like the last versions of physical. I mean, basically, do you even call PlayStation and Xbox One physical copies anymore? I mean, basically you have to insert the disc and then download all of the patches and everything like that. And so once that goes away, I think that's when we'll truly see the end of retro video games for at least a while. I think I can go about like 50 years and then suddenly these games might be worthless. I mean, you know, if somebody's going through my old effects after I'm dead, like, they're probably just going to sell it in an estate sale for, you know, pennies on the dollar, you know? But again, in the next 2 or 3 years, I think retro video game prices will be just fine. And that wraps up this episode of Retronomics on the retro video game bubble. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'd really like to see what you have to say. And if you like this video, give it a like. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more Retronomics topics. I'm Super Nicktendo, and I'll see you next time.